Most of us have a fascination with speed, and in the next 11 minutes and 50 seconds I'm going to explain to you why speed doesn't always give us the things that we think it will. And in fact, sometimes speed, especially if we're relying on cars as a fast mode of transport, sometimes speed steals our time, our money and our health. We're travelling along in our cars thinking this is great, we're saving all this time, but the question we've got to ask ourselves is, how fast are we really going and what is our effective speed? So to explain what effective speed's all about, can I ask you to imagine yourself in a particular situation? You've got a hectic life, your time management's all out of control, you can't get things done fast enough and you can never get to places quickly enough. Sound familiar? So you decide that the solution to this is to buy yourself a new car. Not just any new car, you want to buy yourself the fastest new car in Australia. What is the fastest new car in Australia? Well, I can show you what it is. That's it, the Suzuki Alto, and you'll understand in a little while why that's the fastest new car in Australia. But it may not be the fastest vehicle. Perhaps the fastest vehicle's got a much bigger engine. Could this be the fastest vehicle in Australia? Or does the fastest vehicle in Australia have an engine at all? Could that be the fastest vehicle in Australia? So are we fooling ourselves with the idea that machines can save us time? Well, let's tell you another little story about the machine that saves you time. Imagine that you live in a village and it's your job every day to walk to the river and get a bucket of water. And that takes you 1 hour every day. But you're a genius, so you design a machine that looks a bit like that will take the bucket down to the river, fill it with water and bring it back. And that saves you 1 hour every day. But there's a catch, and the catch is that you've got to spend 1 hour each day winding up the machine, the spring, to make that machine work. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, should we consider the time spent winding up the spring? And the answer is clearly yes. You may still want the machine, but you have to consider that time. Now, in our society, the equivalent of the time spent winding up the spring is the time we spend at work to earn the money to pay for all our transport expenses. And that's what effective speed is all about. It's the total time devoted to transport, not just the time spent travelling. Ivan Illich, in his 1974 book Energy and Equity, applied this in a rather sexist way to the American drivers. And he explained that the typical American male, and that's a picture of a typical American male, devotes more than 1,600 hours a year to the car. So that's the time that person spends in the car driving it, plus the time they spend earning the money to pay for it. He did some simple maths. That's 1,600 hours to get 7,500 miles, less than 5 miles per hour. So no wonder the American drivers always look so unhappy. At this stage, whenever I've given a talk like this before, I can see a lot of people squirming, especially if they've bought a new car and it's not the fastest new car in Australia. So I get all these arguments against effective speed. And let's have a look at a few of them. A lot of young males say, well, my car isn't for transport, it's the image. I use it for attracting females. In fact, what I saw in Canberra was a car with this number plate. Now, clearly it wasn't working because there were only 2 people in the car and they were both males. So my suggestion would be to sell the car, use the money on flowers and chocolates and fancy restaurants. That might improve your chances a bit. You can see the irony in this one, but as well as the irony, if you didn't have to earn the money to pay for the second car, you could work part-time and have plenty of time to walk or cycle to school with your children. You probably know people who say things like this. You've probably got a word to describe them, just like I have. The word I use to describe them starts with W, and it's wrong. And the reason they're wrong is that the faster you drive, the more time you have to devote to transport. So how can we calculate the effective speeds for car drivers? Well, we need to look at the costs, the time and the distance. When we look at the total costs, we can either look at the direct cost, the cost that you and I would pay if we owned and operated a car, or the external cost. And we'll just concentrate today on the direct costs. If we look at the cost of the cars, the operating costs have been calculated for you by organisations like the NRMA, but they don't give you the full story. They don't tell you about car parking, tolls, etc. And if you live in Melbourne or Sydney, then car parking and tolls are very significant. Then you look at the time devoted to the car. The top one is the main time component. That's the time you spend at work to earn the money to pay for the car. The bottom one, the hours in the vehicle itself in each trip, is a minor component. It doesn't matter what you do to that. It doesn't influence the effective speed for the average car driver. So we'll look at some estimates of effective speeds for car drivers using single occupant car driving, or DODOs as Frank Fisher called them, driver only, driver owned, average incomes and direct costs. So for the fastest new car in Australia, in Melbourne you can get 15.8 kilometres an hour in terms of effective speed, Sydney a bit lower. But if you look at the Holden Commodore, which was the top selling car in Australia for 9 out of the last 10 years, that will reduce that effective speed because people have to spend more time at work to earn the money to pay for the Commodore. If you look at some international comparisons, Melbourne and Sydney do pretty well, places like New York and London much more poorly, and Delhi and Nairobi, well, you could crawl faster than a car in Nairobi. A really interesting part of the analysis is what happens to effective speeds if we could increase the trip speeds. If we could somehow travel faster without that costing us anything, what would that do to the effective speeds? Well, let's have a look at a few examples. We'll take the fastest new car in Australia, the Holden Commodore, a cyclist and a bus, and we'll hypothetically increase the trip speed of each of these by 10 kilometres per hour. If we increase the trip speed of the Suzuki Alto by 10 kilometres per hour, that will increase the effective speed by a mere 2.5 kilometres per hour. It's even worse if we look at the Holden Commodore, increase the trip speed by 10 kilometres an hour, that will increase the effective speed by a mere 1.4. If we go to London, increase the trip speed by 10 kilometres an hour, that will increase the effective speed by a mere 0.5. It's just not worth doing. And that also ignores the incredible cost of increasing the speeds, and the cost would be enormous. In London, you'd probably have to demolish Westminster Abbey to build more roads. Now, what if we could get Cadell Evans as our personal trainer, and if we could increase the trip speed of a cyclist by 10 kilometres per hour? Well, that would give us a much better return. And the next one is what you've all been waiting for. What would happen if we could increase the trip speed of a Melbourne bus by 10 kilometres per hour? Well, that would give us an even better return, 8.2 kilometres per hour. And the reason for that is that for a bus passenger, you don't have to spend much time at work earning the money to pay for the bus. Most of the time is actually in the bus, so that's the thing you need to improve. Now, how slow could you go on a bus and still be faster than the fastest new car? Well, in Canberra you'd have to be going reasonably fast to be faster than the fastest new car. Melbourne, not so bad. If we do the comparison for the Holden Commodore, then for Canberra only 17.3 and for Melbourne 13 kilometres per hour. The other thing you've got to think about is, and this is something Kirsty talked about, how time is used in different modes. And as a car driver, there's not much else you can do but drive and perhaps send text messages to other drivers. However, as a bus passenger, there's a lot you can do. For instance, you can read. And if you get on a bus and you find you didn't bring anything to read, that's no problem. You just sit next to somebody who has got something to read. Speed not only consumes our time and our money, but it also consumes space. And you can probably... how many of you have seen this picture before? Okay. It's an interesting picture, but it doesn't tell the whole story. The faster you move in a car, the more space the car requires. So at 50 kilometres an hour, a car is going to need 200 times as much space as a pedestrian. At 100 kilometres an hour, more than 500 times as much space as a pedestrian. Now, we can ask whether active transport modes can save time for everyone, and the answer is clearly yes. And you can see that when you look at data on cities where walking, cycling and public transport, the active transport modes are the main modes, and compare that to cities where cars are the main mode. So if we look at the travel time budgets and compare Western European cities where there's a lot of cycling and a lot of public transport with the North American cities where it's mainly car dominated, in the North American cities they travel further and they travel faster, but they still spend more time travelling. So if we have a look at this, the Western European cities, they only travel for 43 minutes per day. That's all they need to spend travelling. The North American cities spend 55 minutes per day travelling. Now this is really significant because that speed isn't used to save time, it's used to cover more distance. And as the city expands and as local schools and shops and services close, that means that the car drivers have to travel even faster to make up those extra distances. So the low density car dominated cities pay for their speed with longer travel times. So the key message is, if we want to reduce time pressure for urban residents, we should be investing in the fastest modes of transport. And we now know that the fastest modes of transport are in fact the active modes. Thank you very much.